Where do you even begin after a weekend like Watkins Glen? Because this honestly felt like one of those NASCAR events where the racing itself almost got pushed to the background, completely overshadowed by the drama, the tension, and the raw emotion that was building underneath the surface from the very first lap to the very last. And what makes this particular weekend so fascinating to break down is that we're not dealing with just one major story here. We've got two enormous storylines that exploded out of Watkins Glen, and both of them have fans, analysts, and people inside the garage all arguing from completely different angles right now. The first story centers around a veteran superstar who looked like he was genuinely reaching a breaking point, not just in terms of frustration or performance pressure, but physically and emotionally during the race itself. What came over the team radio caught a lot of people completely off guard, and it immediately sparked a conversation that goes way deeper than just one bad weekend or one sick driver grinding through a tough race. The second story has a different kind of energy entirely. It has fans absolutely furious at NASCAR officiating after new footage surfaced online showing a violent, frightening crash that somehow never brought out a caution flag. And once that onboard camera angle started circulating, the one that barely made it onto the television broadcast, the reaction online completely erupted. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. And here's what makes both of these stories feel connected, feel like they belong in the same conversation. They both shine a spotlight on something that NASCAR fans have been noticing more and more as this season gets deeper. The pressure is building, the frustration is real, the decision-making is being questioned at every level, and after Watkins Glen, it genuinely feels like emotions inside the sport are starting to boil over. Drivers are losing patience. Fans are questioning calls. Teams are operating under enormous stress. And the intensity just keeps climbing every single week. So let's get into it, starting with the story that had people worried in a completely different way than usual. The first major story coming out of Watkins Glen has to be Kyle Busch, because even though he actually delivered one of his strongest performances of the entire Cup Series season at the Glen, the post-race conversation had almost nothing to do with the finish itself. Instead, what people were talking about was what fans heard over the team radio, and what that radio message might reveal about where Kyle Busch actually is right now, mentally, physically, and emotionally. During the final stage of the race, Busch came over the radio and asked his Richard Childress racing team to locate a specific doctor after the checkered flag. The way he said it immediately got people's attention, because there was nothing light or casual about his tone. He sounded calm, measured, and genuinely drained, like a man running on empty who was doing everything he could just to hold it together until the race was over. He told the team to find Dr. William Heisel, a physician who has worked extensively with NASCAR teams, drivers, and pit crew members over many years, and made clear he needed to see him the moment the race was done. Nobody knew exactly what was happening at first. And because it's Kyle Busch, a driver who has spent his entire career under a microscope, fans immediately began wondering whether something more serious was going on physically. Then clarification came through that Busch had been battling a significant sinus illness all weekend and needed medical attention after the race because he'd been feeling genuinely terrible throughout the entire event. And here's what makes that detail so striking. Because Kyle Busch didn't just show up at Watkins Glen sick and quietly manage his way to an average finish. He started 21st. He battled a car that was trending tight all afternoon. He navigated strategy calls, managed fuel, moved through traffic on one of the most demanding road courses on the entire schedule, and he brought the number 8 Chevrolet home in 8th place. That ended up being his best finish of the entire 2026 Cup Series season, and his best result in quite some time going back to a strong run at Phoenix. After the race, Busch was straightforward about the day. He acknowledged the team made the right adjustments and strategy calls to move them forward despite qualifying deep in the field. He talked about how the car ran tight throughout the race, that they nearly ran out of fuel at the end, but that they were still heading home with a genuine top 10 result, their second of the season. And on the surface, that sounds like a team building towards something. A positive step. Momentum. But here's where the story becomes something much larger than a driver battling through an illness on race day. Inside the NASCAR garage, there's a growing belief, and it's not coming from one or two people, it's coming from multiple directions, that the emotional tension between Kyle Busch and Richard Childress Racing is reaching a genuinely dangerous point. And if you've been watching this season closely, you don't need anyone inside the garage to tell you that. You can feel it in the broadcasts. You can hear it in the radio traffic. You can see it in the body language after the races. Kyle Busch has had multiple emotional explosions over the radio this year. There was the frustration that boiled over at Martinsville. There was the incident involving John Hunter Nemechek at Texas that became a huge topic of conversation. There's been consistent anger over setups, over speed, over strategy, over mistakes that keep compounding on top of each other week after week. And individually, you could explain any one of those moments away. Drivers get frustrated. Racing is emotional. But when you start putting all of them together, a pattern emerges. During the years when Kyle Busch was winning at Joe Gibbs Racing, and he won a lot, 2 championships, 90-something cup wins, his emotional radio traffic was almost expected. It was part of the deal. He could be furious with the team for 3 hours straight and still end up in victory lane at the end of the day. The frustration had an outlet. It had a destination. It produced results, and it made Busch one of the most compelling, fascinating drivers of his entire generation. But now the wins aren't coming, and when the victories disappear, the same frustration that once looked like intensity and competitiveness starts to look like something else entirely. It starts to look like a driver who is wearing down. There are also reports that people inside Richard Childress Racing are beginning to feel the emotional weight of the situation themselves. Nobody is publicly attacking anyone right now. Nobody is throwing each other under the bus in post-race interviews. But the pressure is clearly present on both sides of this relationship, and pretending otherwise doesn't do anyone any favors. And this is the uncomfortable conversation that some NASCAR fans don't love having, because Kyle Busch is 41 years old, and he is absolutely still a talented race car driver. Nobody who understands this sport seriously disputes that. But the questions being asked, by fans, by analysts, by people who have spent decades in this garage, are about something bigger than raw talent. They're asking whether the accumulated weight of years of pressure, frustration, expectation, and intensity is starting to take a toll that talent alone can't overcome. Whether the fire is still burning the same way it always burned. Kevin Harvick recently offered an opinion that many people found sobering, suggesting that Busch may not have many strong options outside of Richard Childress Racing moving forward in his career. And if that's accurate, it changes the entire emotional texture of this partnership, because it means the pressure on both sides is even higher. There's no easy exit ramp available. This has to work, and everyone knows it. So watching Kyle Busch at Watkins Glen carried a kind of emotional weight that most top 10 finishes simply don't carry. On one level, you saw flashes of the old Rowdy. Smart race management, excellent road course execution, moving through the field from 21st. Grinding through physical illness without making it an excuse, delivering a result when the season desperately needed one. All of that was real, and it deserved recognition. But on another level, you also saw something else. A veteran driver who sounds exhausted in a way that goes beyond just one sick weekend, a driver carrying frustration that has been building for months, a driver who is trying his absolute hardest to stop a spiral before the second half of this season slips completely out of reach. And the tension between those two versions of what you were watching made Watkins Glen genuinely difficult to process. Because for so many years, Kyle Busch was the driver that everyone else in the garage feared. He was the one who could show up on any Sunday and ruin your afternoon before you even saw it coming. Now every decent finish gets swallowed immediately by a broader conversation about pressure, contracts, uncertainty, and what the future actually looks like for one of the most talented drivers this sport has ever produced. That shift in narrative is jarring, and it didn't happen overnight. Now, let's shift to the second major story from Watkins Glen. And this one has a completely different energy. This one has fans angry. Not frustrated, not disappointed. Genuinely, loudly angry. And honestly, after seeing the footage that started circulating online after the race, it's hard to say the reaction is unreasonable. With approximately 10 laps remaining in the race, Cody Ware was running behind Ricky Stenhouse Jr. as the field came through turn 7. Then Ware suddenly lost control, and his car slammed head-on into the infield tire barrier in a brutal, violent impact. But the initial crash wasn't even the most alarming part. The force of the hit sent Ware's car spinning violently back toward the racing surface, and footage that emerged afterward appeared to show the Armco barrier behind the tires taking actual damage from the severity of the impact. When the onboard camera footage from Ware's car started circulating online after the broadcast, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Fans who had been watching the race live and hadn't fully seen the crash suddenly understood what had actually happened, and the anger online reflected that. The consensus from a huge portion of the NASCAR fanbase was that this crash absolutely warranted a caution flag, and the fact that it didn't get one was a serious failure of officiating judgment. Part of the frustration was also directed at the television broadcast itself, which offered viewers almost no look at the crash in real time. The coverage briefly showed Ware's damaged car sitting off to the side for a moment, and that was essentially it. No replays, no serious examination of the impact, no real explanation of what had just happened to a driver's car or what condition the barrier was in. And when the onboard angle finally surfaced after the race and people could see exactly how violent that crash had been, the criticism of the broadcast operation intensified alongside the criticism of the officiating. Some fans went further, arguing that the crash looked more violent than several incidents earlier in the race that actually did bring out caution flags. Whether or not that comparison holds up under scrutiny, the perception itself became part of the problem. Because in NASCAR, perception around caution decisions matters enormously, and the perception coming out of Watkins Glen was that NASCAR got this one wrong. Now, in fairness to NASCAR's decision-making in the moment, Cody Ware was eventually able to limp the damaged car back to the garage under green conditions, which suggests the car was at least mobile enough to clear the racing surface. And NASCAR likely factored that into the call. If the driver can move the vehicle and the track is clear, there's a reasonable argument that a green flag situation can be maintained. Earlier in the same race, both Bubba Wallace and Josh Berry were involved in spins that also stayed green, largely because both drivers kept their cars moving and the track stayed open. But this is exactly the kind of consistency problem that creates friction between NASCAR's officiating and its fanbase on a weekly basis. One week, NASCAR is throwing cautions that fans believe are completely unnecessary, debris cautions that nobody can see, late race yellows that feel manufactured. The next week, a car slams into a barrier hard enough to potentially damage the safety infrastructure, and the green flag stays out. The decision-making standard feels impossible to predict, and when fans can't identify a clear, consistent principle behind caution calls, they default to frustration. Every week, Watkins Glen became another example of that ongoing disconnect, and the conversation it sparked is one that's been had before and will almost certainly be had again before this season is over. In the middle of all the drama and controversy, there was one storyline coming out of Watkins Glen that was simply about exceptional racing, and it belongs in this conversation even if it got somewhat overshadowed by everything else happening around it. Shane van Gisbergen won the race for Trackhouse Racing, and he didn't just win it, he put on a clinic. Another methodical, masterful road course performance that reminded everyone watching exactly why this driver is in a category completely by himself whenever NASCAR visits a circuit layout. He wasn't dominant in practice. His team made adjustments heading into qualifying, found something, and from there the weekend turned into something special. Strategy calls from his crew chief helped position him to run down the leaders in the closing stages, and when he got to the front, he made it look routine in the way that only genuinely elite road course specialists can. After the race, Van Gisbergen credited his team, praised the car, and acknowledged that the weekend turned around in qualifying after they hadn't been particularly strong in practice. There was nothing flashy or complicated about how he described it, just a driver and a team who found what they needed when it mattered, and then executed. What's becoming increasingly clear as this season develops is that Shane van Gisbergen on a road course is starting to feel less like a competitive advantage and more like an inevitability. The gap between what he's capable of on these circuits and what most of the rest of the field is able to match is significant, and it keeps showing up every time the schedule puts a road course on the calendar. What made Watkins Glen feel so emotionally heavy wasn't any single moment. It was the accumulation. Kyle Busch battling illness while carrying the weight of a frustrating season and an uncertain future. Fans questioning officiating decisions in real time and then getting angrier when the footage came out after the broadcast. A television broadcast that left viewers without crucial information about what was actually happening on the track. And underneath all of it, The sense that this season is operating at a pitch of intensity that keeps climbing higher every single week. Every race feels like it carries more weight now. Every mistake feels magnified. Every radio message becomes a headline. Every caution decision becomes a multi-day debate. And that atmosphere, tense, emotional, unpredictable, genuinely dramatic, is part of what makes NASCAR impossible to look away from right now. The pressure inside this sport feels real. The emotions feel real. And after Watkins Glen, it's hard to argue that things are going to calm down anytime soon.